listener production.
Hi, Sasha Barbagat with you. Welcome to The Briefing. For the last year, we've heard almost every day about the horrific and steadily rising number of Palestinians killed by Israeli forces in Gaza. Today, that number sits at 42,792 people. But Israel has claimed this figure is inflated, while others say the true number of people killed is far larger than what's being reported. In the second half of this episode, we find out how deaths in Gaza and other war zones around the world are verified and why it's so important. First, though, it's time for the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Friday, the 25th of October.
Morning, Sash. Morning, everybody. Australia has been forced to defend its record on climate change at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. The event's being held in Samoa, and Pacific Island leaders have used the meeting to pressure Australia, the UK and Canada on their emissions. A new report tabled at CHOGM named out the three nations for contributing 60% of emissions generated from extraction across Commonwealth countries since 1990. Foreign Minister Penny Wong has responded by pointing to China and India as the world's biggest emitters.
All of us have to respond on climate, all major economies in particular.
Meantime, Anthony Albanese defended the country's record on addressing climate change, saying Australia has been taking a leading role. And that's not the only beef the Prime Minister has been caught up in at CHOGM, Chris. He's also been forced to respond to accusations from China that Australia is home to, quote, systemic racism and hate crimes. Now, this came after one of our own diplomats condemned Beijing over human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Tibet. After landing in Samoa for CHOGM, Albanese responded to the comments by saying Australia will still disagree with China when it must. And that's an interesting point because this is kind of the frostiest, most tense exchange China and Australia have had in quite a while, because when Albanese took the reins in 2022 as Prime Minister, that was one of the focuses of his government, was to repair the relationship with China. I mean, we know that we are still doing things like AUKUS, which is keeping an eye on what China's doing in the South China Sea and all of that. But in terms of our diplomatic relationship, Albanese wanted to repair it. And this represents kind of almost a return to what we were seeing when Scott Morrison was Prime Minister. It was a few more testy exchanges. And, you know, a signal of our improving relationship was all those trade bans being lifted. Lobster was the latest one just a couple of weeks ago. So interesting to see this kind of war of words erupt once again.
Sticking with China, President Xi Jinping has called for a comprehensive ceasefire in Gaza and a halt in the spread of the war in Lebanon. This was at the three-day BRICS summit hosted by Russian President Vladimir Putin, who also warned the Middle East is on the brink of a full-scale war. Something he says is a chain reaction to the rise in tensions between Israel and Iran, which I found really fascinating that he pointed that out, Sash. Interestingly, also, there was a declaration by BRICS leaders calling for a two-state solution with regards to the war in Gaza, saying a sovereign, independent and viable Palestinian state must be established.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone was necessarily expecting this position out of BRICS. I think we kind of look at these nations as the rogue ones that are up to no good, but this was interesting to see them come out and discuss. It is worth noting as well that both the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and Iran's Masoud Pezeshkian were in attendance, and the Iranian president took aim at international organisations like the UN for failing to end the conflict in Gaza. But look, despite criticism, the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres were among those who attended, and he said peace was needed in Gaza, Lebanon, as well as Sudan and Ukraine. Yes, Ukraine was also discussed, even though Vladimir Putin was hosting the meeting. And as much as there was all this discussion dedicated to ending these conflicts, there were no specifics given on how to do that. But again, interesting that these nations in particular wanted to put out this kind of statement on what they think should happen with the Palestinian state.
And it was a sentiment that was reflected as well in France. The president there, Emmanuel Macron, has overnight hosted an aid summit in Paris. And there were ministers and representatives there of over 70 countries and international organisations like the EU. And they were there to raise donations for the cash-strapped Lebanese government specifically. So France has pledged to provide 100 million euros. That's 163 million Australian dollars. And speaking alongside Macron was the acting Lebanese Prime Minister. He said that his government has decided to recruit more troops, 8,000 of which could be deployed into his country's south. So he said he needs international support to equip them and train that army. The EU's foreign policy chief told reporters that the 27-nation bloc will give the Lebanese army 20 million euros this year, so that's 32.6 million Australian dollars, and 40 million euros, so that's 65.3 million Australian dollars next year, Sash.
More than 15 years on, juicy details about a deal between warring Labor leaders Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard have been detailed. The pair apparently had a secret deal that would have seen Rudd hand over the prime ministership to Gillard after 2 terms following his 2007 election win.
Yes, very spicy here. And the claims come out of a new memoir by former Victorian Socialist left leader and Senator Kim Carr. He claims he forged the deal in 2006, but that Gillard reneged by using tricked-up polling to undermine the PM in 2010 during his government's first term. So what happened instead was a challenge on the PM's leadership and Gillard taking the reins, but just 3 years later, Rudd challenged her and won to become the leader again. And Sash, I was quite young at this time, but it just started this very weird and strange time in Australian politics.
It was absolutely bizarre. What followed as well, Labor had the back and forth, and then when the Liberal Party was elected, because the Australian public was so sick of the in-warring and the in-fighting, Tony Abbott took the reins, then Malcolm Turnbull knifed him, and then Scott Morrison knifed him. So it was just nuts. And then, Scott Morrison did get re-elected as Prime Minister, and then it kind of all stabled out a little bit after that. But you're right. It was an absolutely insane period. I do want to mention as well that The Guardian, who published this article that was a look at Kim Carr's memoir, they reached out to Julia Gillard, and a spokesperson for the former PM said that she published her memoirs in 2014, and these detail how she became Prime Minister and her time in office, which is effectively her saying, my recollection of events is right, but no denial specifically of what Kim Carr's talking about. But either way, we'll probably never really know the full details of what went on in the halls of Canberra in those crazy years. And expect to see a lot of ray guns at Halloween parties this year. The Aussie Olympic breakdancer, who went viral in August for her cringy performance in Paris, is expected to be the second most popular costume on October 31. Now, Chris, you haven't seen this script, so all your reactions here are perfectly genuine because you wanted to be shocked by this story.
I made it very firm. I did not want to read or prepare this script at all. Hit me.
A little bit of fun for a Friday. Google has released data showing what people are searching in the lead up to the spooky holiday, and they've revealed the top 25 cozies for 2024. So I'm going to reveal the top 3 to you. I feel like you're going to be surprised. Bob is number 1. Now, this was the shrunken head ghost from the recent Beetlejuice sequel.
Oh, yeah. Okay, I've seen promos.
Yeah, and I've seen some people already dressing up as him. It's a good costume. Yeah. A ray gun, as we heard, is second.
Classic.
Third was Catnap, which I've never heard of.
What is that?
It is the cat-like monster from the popular video game series Poppy Playtime.
No.
I do want to point out these are American stats, so maybe these are more popular overseas.
Like for children too, right?
Yeah, but also in the top 10 were Deadpool's female counterpart, Lady Deadpool, which I think is great, and singer Sabrina Carpenter, who we're both a big fan of. Yeah. So I think that's fun. Google's also revealed some of the top trending costumes by US cities. Now, this one I particularly liked. Bluey is the most popular in 5. So go Blue Dog. But I feel like even though these are this is US data, it's a good indication of what we'll see celebs dressing up as, because remember, we get all the images for us, it's the next day when they're all at their fancy parties. But also we will see similar things down under as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it's fascinating for me because I went to Catholic school as a teenager, so like Halloween, not a thing. You were definitely not allowed to celebrate Halloween. And that was in keeping with my home as well. We're not Catholic, but it was in keeping with my home because demonic Halloween, you cannot celebrate. It's a celebration of evil. But now that you've got me thinking about Australian, costumes and outfits, weather briefing, we do news every day. So we'd have to come up with something that's news adjacent.
Sure.
So immediately I'm kind of thinking maybe I could rock up to a party this year dressed as the ACT's Liberal leader, Elizabeth Lee. Because it's as simple as just putting on a navy blue fit and sticking up a middle finger.
Yeah, so for anyone who isn't getting this reference, we talked about this, Was it this week?
Last week?
I don't know.
I can't even
It all
remember.
blends into one. But yeah, she was, this was the ACT Liberal leader. It was last week because the election was over the weekend, who stuck her finger up at a journo because she was so sick of him. Yeah, I racked my brains for iconic, I guess maybe some vapes, because we were so hard on vapes this year. Everyone's going to be dressing up as those colourful little plastic things.
Yeah, actually, that is quite colourful and poppy. I like that.
And everyone, vapes have had a really tough year, so maybe people want to give them a shout out. Okay, that's enough. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for joining us for the headlines. Look, we are changing pace in a big way now. We are going to look at how you verify a body count in a war zone.
Hey, Bension here. Death toll. It's this shorthand phrase we use for facts that are simply too devastating to express in any news report. We constantly hear about the rising death toll in Gaza. But when we hear that at the time of recording, 42,792 people have been killed by Israeli forces in Gaza since Hamas killed 1,200 Israelis on October 7, it is vitally important that those numbers are right. Israel has claimed that the number of Palestinians killed has been significantly inflated by the Gaza Health Ministry. Others have said far more people have been killed over the past year because they're under the rubble or they've died from malnourishment, and that isn't accounted for in this number. We have to remember that this is not just a number. These are individual human beings who deserve to be acknowledged and remembered. So how does anyone verify the death of individuals in a war zone, in Gaza and also anywhere else in the world? Professor Michael Spagat is the chair of Every Casualty Counts, an NGO dedicated to this exact mission. He's also a professor of economics at Royal Holloway, University of London. Michael, thanks for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you.
Is there any globally recognised standard or method for counting the number of people who've died in a war?
No, I would say there's not one single globally recognized standard. There are various methods for trying to estimate such amounts using statistical methods, probably the most prominent one being sample survey, which is similar to how, say, political opinion polling is done, except that you ask the people that you interview for a roster of people in their household before a conflict, and then you ask them how many people have died, and you estimate off of that. At Every Casualty Counts, we support what's known as casualty recording, which is trying to record individually, one by one, every single person killed in armed conflict and individually recognizing all of them. This is closely related to trying to count up the total number of people killed, but it's not exactly the same thing. It's more about memorialization and recognition of the lives lost.
Can you just give me an example of how that would work in a particular conflict?
So you take a random sample of households, and it's important to understand that households here have to be well-defined units. So ideally, what you try to do is partition the entire population of the country into non-overlapping units that cover the entire population of the country so that each individual in the country belongs to exactly one unit. Then you select a bunch of these at random, and then you ask someone that can speak for the household, say a head of household, just a small set of questions, essentially naming every single person who was alive at the beginning of the conflict and was a member of that household, and then follow-up questions about the fate of each one. In particular, is that person alive or dead? From that, you get a percentage of the household within the sample who have been killed in the conflict. And from that, you then extrapolate a percentage of the entire population of the country killed. So if 1% of the people within the sample were killed, then your estimate is that 1% of the people in the entire conflict were killed. And then there are ways of putting error bands around that as well.
In terms of a particular conflict, we are told in Gaza by the Gaza Health Ministry that more than 42,000 people have been killed since Israel began its bombardment in response to October 7 more than a year ago. How do we know whether that figure is accurate?
That figure is produced using casualty recording as advocated by Every Casualty Counts. So the Ministry of Health is listing one by one people they say have been killed in the conflict. And they're doing that through a few channels, but the primary channel is recording dead individuals who pass through hospital morgues. One way that we can be assured that this is a solid method that they're using is that each one of these victims, they list a name, they list an age, they list a sex, and most important of all, they list a national identification number. And maybe many of your listeners will be surprised to learn, but those national identification numbers are originally assigned by the Israeli statistical authorities. So when there's a new baby born in Gaza, at least prior to October 7, that event is reported to the Israeli statistical authorities who then assign an ID number. And that means that the Israelis have the wherewithal to check every single person on this list and verify at a minimum that that person is a real person who existed. Now, it doesn't completely foreclose the possibility that some people may be on the list who are real people but are actually still alive and not dead. But if that were happening at anything like scale, other than like just a few anomalous mistakes, I think we would know about that by now.
There has been estimates that the true death toll in Gaza could be more at the level of, say, 180,000 people. What goes into that kind of estimate?
Yeah, you're referring to a letter that was published in the Lancet. So all it really did was look at 13 conflicts, at least 12 of which really look entirely different from the conflict in Gaza. And then they took some extremely crude measurements of indirect nonviolent deaths. But I don't think that anyone should be taking that letter published in the Lancet seriously.
There are also the people who have died who would still be under the rubble, so to speak. Is that taken into account in any kind of way? And is there any way for us to know how many people that might account for?
So I mentioned that the main method that the Ministry of Health is using to record deaths in the conflict are dead bodies passing through hospital morgues. But there is one other main channel through which deaths can be accounted for in their figures, which is that there's a form that's publicly available that people can fill out to report deaths of people that they know about. Those are then investigated. There's a judicial process there, and if the death is considered to be documented, then it goes onto the list, and the family members receive a death certificate. Now, there's a figure that's been widely circulated of 10,000 under the rubble deaths, but it's unclear really where that comes from, and it's been kind of a stagnant figure that has been appearing for a long time without really moving. So I'm not sure that we should attach a lot of weight onto that figure.
What would you say to someone who says, well, I just don't believe any of the numbers coming out of this conflict?
First thing I would say is that the Ministry of Health numbers are produced and released with a phenomenal level of transparency. So they're not just claiming numbers out of thin air. They're actually releasing detailed lists with names on the lists, with ID numbers on the lists, with ages and sexes, so that anyone can actually check into it. And in fact, some people have checked into it. So there's the NGO Air Wars, which has done quite a remarkable study where Air Wars took reports of deaths that have been appearing in media and social media. And when there were names given in the social media reports, they then checked to see if those names appear on the Ministry of Health list. And they find that indeed, something like 75% of the names that they find in the social media reports are duplicated on the Ministry of Health list. So that gives a lot of credibility. It has to be said that the Israelis have been very critical of these numbers, but Israel has not done anything at all, really, to try to advance this discussion. They're not putting out anything like a detailed list of people killed or events, a list of events in which they think that there have been people killed. So they're kind of criticizing off to the side, but not putting out anything themselves. They've a couple times floated numbers of combatants they say have been killed, but they haven't done anything to document or back up those numbers.
Is the challenge of identifying the number of people who've died in that conflict the same kind of challenge as identifying the number of people who've died in, say, Ukraine or Sudan or Myanmar?
So the challenges are the same. One thing that I think we can learn from both Ukraine and Gaza is even when there are thousands, even tens of thousands of deaths, it is possible to document a significant number of those deaths in real time. This has been done really by civil society organizations that have sprung up in Ukraine to do this. You hear a lot about the UN numbers in Ukraine, but the UN numbers are highly reliant on civil society casualty recorders. In Gaza, it's been done officially by an official entity, the Ministry of Health. But what we need really is we need to first have pressure on states to do this themselves. And Every Casualty Counts insists that this is a legal obligation, that states must do it, and there should be support for civil society organizations that are recording this information. In Sudan, we know of no official organization that's doing this. There's talk that there should be a UN fact-finding mission sent to Sudan to try to document and preserve information on casualties. But so far, there's nothing like this. So it's only plucky civil society organizations that have sprung up to do this. Myanmar is a similar situation to Sudan, Ethiopia as well. But there's not enough support, not nearly enough to fulfill the mission of trying to recognize every single person killed in armed conflict.
Why is it so important to count every single person who is killed in these kinds of conflicts?
It's not just about counting. Counting I think of as trying to arrive at the number, but it's the recognition of individuals who have been killed, individuals, not just the numbers, although you get the numbers as a byproduct of trying to recognize individuals one by one. And I think it's really part of what we are as human beings. The fact that we get civil society organizations springing up to do this kind of work shows that there's a need for it. Relatives of people who've been killed, they want to see that their loved ones are recognized as individuals who lived and then died, unfortunately, in a conflict. And then hopefully, the more that this is done, the higher the bar is to start future conflicts. Individual recognition is an attempt to overcome the dehumanization that seems to take place during conflict, that seems to make it okay to just kill lots of anonymous people.
That's an important message. Michael, thanks so much for joining us today on The Briefing.
Thank you very much.
Professor Michael Spagat there. He's a professor of economics at Royal Holloway University of London and chair of Every Casualty Counts. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Briefing. That's it for now. If you value what we do here at The Briefing, please make sure to hit that follow button. And if you want to keep up with our other content, you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast and on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed with another episode this afternoon from 3. And that's not all from The Briefing. On Saturday, you'll hear from Antoinette Lattouf, who's joined by podcasters and designers Nikki and Lucy to talk about happy hours and life after 30. I'm Bension Siebert. Catch you next time.
Listener.